The town of Blackwood Creek festered in a narrow valley, its residents, hearts as gray and brittle as the weathered clapboard buildings that lined the dusty main street and bore silent witness to years of moral decay. For 3 long years, the widow Margaret Hawthorne had endured a daily gauntlet of cruelty from the very people who should have offered her compassion and neighborly aid after the tragic mining accident that claimed her husband. Her spine had been twisted in a fall while trying to save him from a collapsing shaft, leaving her bent and reliant on a hand-carved cedar cane that her late husband had made for her years ago. The town's children, following the example of their depraved parents, would follow her along the boardwalk, mimicking her labored gait and chanting cruel rhymes about the hobbling witch of Hawthorne Hill. The adults were far worse. Their mockery, a venomous cocktail of whispered insults and open derision whenever she ventured to the mercantile for the meager supplies her widow's pension could afford her. Mayor Calvin Stokes, a bloated and self-satisfied man who owned the general store, made a public spectacle of charging her double for everything, laughing at her powerlessness while the townsfolk cheered him on. The blacksmith, a brute named Harlan Cross, found endless amusement in blocking her path with heavy ambles or shod horses, forcing her to painfully navigate around while his cronies howled with savage delight. Even the women of the town, led by the mayor's wife Priscilla, would gather on the church steps to snicker as Margaret passed, mocking the patchwork repairs on her faded widow's weeds. The preacher, a spineless coward named Reverend Thorpe, never once rebuked his flock, instead offering Margaret private platitudes about enduring suffering while publicly shaking his head as if she were cursed. Margaret's only sanctuary was a small, dilapidated cabin on the outskirts, where she tended a few scraggly hens and spoke to her husband's grave beneath an ancient cottonwood tree. The isolation was absolute, a suffocating blanket of loneliness that pressed down upon her twisted frame with far more weight than her physical deformities ever could, and her tears had long since dried. Into this pit of communal depravity rode a stranger on a steel gray stallion, his arrival as silent and sudden as the first cold wind that heralds a devastating prairie storm. He was tall and whipcord lean, his features carved from the same granite that lined the mountain passes, and his eyes were the frozen blue of a winter sky just before it unleashes a killer blizzard. A weathered black duster hung from his broad shoulders, and the walnut grip of a Colt peacemaker was tied low on his hip with the casual readiness of a man who knew its every whisper. He reined in at the edge of town, observing a scene that made his jaw tighten imperceptibly as a pack of young toughs pelted the crippled widow with horse dung while their fathers watched and grinned. Margaret did not cry out, having learned long ago that complaint only brought worse torment, and she simply shielded her face with a trembling arm as she tried to shuffle toward her cabin. The stranger, who had introduced himself at no saloon and signed no ledger, watched in silence until his knuckles were white on the reins, then he gently heeled his horse forward. His name was Gideon, though the town would not learn it until it was seared into their memory with the heat of a branding iron, and he had not come to Blackwood Creek by accident. Years before, he had served as a territorial marshal in a district that included this valley, and he had received a frantic letter from Margaret's husband just weeks before the accident that killed him. The letter had been delayed, lost in a mail coach robbery, only now finding its way to Gideon's hands, and its contents detailed a conspiracy of claim jumping and murder that stained the entire town. He had come to investigate, but the cruelty he witnessed shifted his purpose from lawman to executioner, for he recognized the stench of a town that had abandoned all pretense of humanity. Gideon dismounted in front of the mercantile, his spurs jingling a death knell, and he did not announce his name or his business. He simply walked inside and stared at Mayor Stokes. The mayor's practiced smirk faltered as he took in the stranger's cold, unwavering gaze, a gaze that seemed to strip away his petty authority and expose the maggot of a soul beneath his silk vest. "I need supplies," Gideon said flatly, his voice a low rumble of distant thunder, and when Stokes quoted an inflated price out of habit, the stranger didn't flinch but simply paid the fair amount. Stokes, unnerved but too arrogant to back down, scoffed and called Gideon a fool for overpaying. And that single word sealed the mayor's fate like a hammer striking a coffin nail. Gideon took his supplies and rode not to the saloon but to the widow's cabin, where he found Margaret trembling on her porch, expecting yet another round of torment from a new face. He dismounted and removed his hat, a gesture of profound respect that she had not witnessed from any man in 3 years, and he introduced himself as an old friend of her late husband. Tears, long dried and forgotten, welled in Margaret's eyes as she heard the name Elias spoken with reverence instead of the usual derision, and she invited the stranger inside with a shaking voice. Over a simple meal of stale bread and thin broth, Gideon listened as Margaret recounted every cruelty, every stolen possession, every night she spent fearing the mob would burn her cabin. He asked about the accident, and her voice dropped to a whisper as she confessed that Elias had discovered a rich silver vein, and the men who claimed he died in a collapse had actually murdered him. She had been silenced by threats, her twisted spine a permanent reminder of the beating she received when she tried to scream the truth, and the town had closed ranks like a clenched fist. Gideon's expression did not change, but a terrible calm settled over him, the kind of stillness that precedes a volcanic eruption, and he assured Margaret that the reckoning would begin at dawn. He spent the night in her barn, not for sleep, but for preparation, cleaning his revolver and crafting a list from the letter in her testimony, a list of every name stained with her suffering. At first light, Gideon rode back into town, his duster billowing like a shroud, and he tied his horse in front of the jail, an abandoned building since the last marshal had been bought off by the mayor's gold. He entered the blacksmith's shop, finding Harlan Cross hammering a horseshoe with sadistic force, and the brute laughed, asking if the stranger had come to beg for a shoe for his nag. Gideon did not answer with words. His fist lashed out like a striking rattler, shattering the blacksmith's nose and sending him crashing into the cold forge with a shower of sparks. Before Cross could rise, Gideon's boot was on his throat, and he spoke in that same low rumble, listing every time the brute had blocked the widow's path or hurled a stone. The blacksmith gurgled a threat, and Gideon leaned closer, whispering that the next time he touched the widow, he would lose the hand, and the next time after that, his life. He left Cross bleeding in the ashes and walked to the general store, where Mayor Stokes was pontificating to a crowd of sycophants about the stranger's insolence the previous day. The crowd parted as Gideon ascended the steps, and Stokes puffed out his chest, demanding to know what right this drifter had to assault a respected citizen of Blackwood Creek. Gideon's reply cut through the murmuring crowd with surgical precision, revealing that he was a duly appointed territorial marshal with jurisdiction over this district, and his badge had never been revoked. He'd produced a tarnished silver star from his duster, its sudden appearance like a holy relic in a den of blasphemers, and Stokes's face drained of all color as the crowd gasped. "You are all guilty," Gideon announced, his voice carrying to every corner of the silent street, of conspiracy to murder Elias Hawthorne, of theft of his claim, and of systematic abuse of his widow. He began to read from the list, naming Harlan Cross, Calvin Stokes, Priscilla Stokes, and a dozen other principal tormentors, each name a thunderbolt that struck the accused with visible terror. The preacher tried to interject with a platitude about forgiveness, and Gideon silenced him with a glare, stating that the reverend would either assist in the arrest or be charged as an accessory. One of the named men, a teamster named Burley, drew a hidden knife and lunged at Gideon, and the marshal's Colt appeared in his hand with a speed that defied human comprehension. The shot echoed like the crack of doom, and Burley crumpled with a bullet through his shoulder, alive but screaming, a demonstration of precision that left no doubt about the stranger's capabilities. Gideon calmly holstered his weapon and ordered the townsfolk to bind the wounded man and lock him in the jail, a command that was obeyed with trembling, frantic haste. He then turned to Mayor Stokes, who was blubbering about his rights and his lawyer, and Gideon informed him that territorial justice did not require a lawyer when a marshal bore witness. The confession of the widow, combined with the letter from Elias Hawthorne detailing the threats and the claim jump, was more than enough for a frontier court to issue summary judgment. Stokes, realizing the trap had closed around him, made a desperate bid to flee, scrambling through the back of his store. But Gideon was waiting, having anticipated the coward's only exit. The mayor found himself staring down the barrel of the peacemaker, and his legs gave way, collapsing into a puddle of his own making as the town looked on in horrified silence. Priscilla Stokes screamed that Gideon was a monster, and he turned to her with a chilling calm, asking if she had ever once offered Margaret a kind word instead of mocking her dresses. The woman's mouth opened and closed like a fish, and the other women who had laughed with her suddenly found the dusty ground infinitely fascinating, their guilt a palpable fog. One by one, Gideon apprehended the named perpetrators, and the jail soon overflowed with the town's elite, their fine clothes now rumpled with fear sweat and the grime of their own sins. He deputized the few townsfolk who had shown even a flicker of decency, a timid schoolmaster and a young farmer who had once left a basket of eggs on Margaret's porch in secret. By noon, the depravity of Blackwood Creek had been dragged into the merciless sunlight, and the remaining residents stood in a dazed huddle, finally seeing themselves as the outsiders must have seen them. Gideon then walked to the widow's cabin, and he did not need to tell her what had transpired, for the sudden silence of the town spoke louder than any gunshot ever could. He led her back to the main street, her twisted spine a painful crown of endurance, and the townsfolk, unable to meet her eyes, shifted and shuffled in a guilty, squirming mass. "This woman," Gideon announced, "is the rightful owner of the Hawthorne silver vein, and every penny stolen from her claim will be restored from the assets of the convicted." He then did something utterly unexpected. He knelt before Margaret and offered her the marshal's badge, asking her to serve as the town's new justice of the peace, a permanent guardian of the law. The crowd gasped, but no one dared to object, and Margaret, after a long moment of stunned silence, reached out a trembling hand and took the silver star, her knuckles white on the metal. She straightened as much as her broken body would allow, and for the first time in 3 years, she looked at her tormentors not with fear, but with a grave and sorrowful authority. Gideon stood beside her, his role shifting from executioner to herald, and he informed the town that a circuit judge would arrive within a week to conduct the formal trials. Until then, Margaret Hawthorne would preside over Blackwood Creek, and any who defied her would answer directly to the man who had broken their blacksmith and shot their teamster. The weeks that followed were a painful, transformative crucible for the town, as Margaret dispensed not vengeance, but a stern and impartial justice that left the guilty stripped of their power. The stolen wealth was returned, the Hawthorne claim reopened under her management, and the bullies who had tormented her were sentenced to hard labor rebuilding the very infrastructure they had neglected. Harlan Cross, his nose forever crooked, was ordered to forge a new iron gate for Margaret's property, a symbol of her sanctuary that he would see every day as he passed by in shame. Mayor Stokes and his wife were forced to work in the widow's henhouse, collecting eggs and mucking out coops, their silk and satin reduced to sackcloth in a poetic reversal of fortune. The preacher was relocated to a distant mission, his cowardice deemed unfit for a flock that needed true moral guidance, and a new reverend, a man of genuine compassion, was eventually installed. Margaret, for her part, blossomed in the most unexpected way, her voice growing stronger with each decree, her twisted spine no longer a mark of shame but a badge of absolute resilience. She never walked easily, but she walked proudly, and the children who had once thrown dung now doffed their caps when she passed, their rhymes replaced with a respectful, fearful silence. Gideon stayed longer than he intended, drawn not by duty but by a profound admiration for the widow's unbroken spirit and the quiet, deep conversations they shared on her porch. He would ride out to the claim with her, sitting astride his gray stallion while she rode in a specially crafted wagon, and together they oversaw the honest extraction of silver that now benefited her. One evening, under a sky bursting with the cold fire of uncountable stars, he admitted that he had come seeking only to right a single wrong, but he had found something he had lost long ago. He had found a reason to believe in humanity again, a faith he had surrendered after witnessing too many massacres and too much corruption in the territories he had once patrolled. Margaret listened, her hand resting on his, and she told him that his justice had been the catalyst, but his staying was the true healing, a balm that went deeper than any court decree. Their bond, forged in the crucible of mutual respect and shared pain, deepened into a quiet, steadfast love that needed no dramatic declarations or grandiose gestures, only silent companionship. When the circuit judge finally arrived and the trials concluded, with guilty verdicts and prison sentences for the worst offenders, Gideon's official duty was officially and completely discharged. The town expected him to ride on, as all such avenging angels did in stories, but Gideon surprised them by purchasing a small parcel of land adjacent to Margaret's claim. He hung up his marshal's badge for good, though he kept his peacemaker clean and ready, and became a rancher and a partner in the Hawthorne Silver Mining Company, a legitimate enterprise. Margaret continued to serve as justice of the peace for many years, her ruling so fair and so wise that even neighboring settlements began to bring their disputes to the crippled judge. The silver-laced scars of the past never fully faded, but they were transformed into landmarks of a journey, not open wounds, and the town's children grew up with a deep, inherited shame. They learned the story of Gideon's arrival as a cautionary tale about the poison of cruelty, and every year on the anniversary of the reckoning, they held a day of silent reflection. No one laughed on that day, and no one ever dared to mock the weak again, for the legacy of the stranger who rode in to execute justice was etched into the town's very DNA. Gideon and Margaret, married in a quiet ceremony under the cottonwood tree where Elias lay buried, the groom's steel-gray hair a testament to his long, hard road to this peaceful moment. He held her twisted hand with infinite gentleness, and when he kissed her forehead, the entire town stood at a respectful distance, witnessing the union with a collective lump in their throats. The years that followed were prosperous and serene, their mine producing wealth that Margaret used to build a hospital and a school, ensuring that no one would ever be abandoned again. Gideon taught the young men how to shoot, not to kill but to protect, and he instilled in them a code of honor that became the new unwritten law of Blackwood Creek and its surroundings. They had a child, a daughter they named Hope, a girl with her mother's luminous eyes and her father's unyielding spirit, and she grew up hearing the tale of her parents' extraordinary beginning. Hope would run through the streets, her mother's cane now hanging on the wall as a relic, and the old-timers who had once mocked Margaret would look away in shame when the girl passed. Margaret never harbored bitterness, teaching Hope that justice had been served and that forgiveness was a gift she gave herself, not a pardon for the unrepentant, but a release for her own soul. As the decades turned, the story spread across the frontier, a legend of the marshal who traded gold for scars and the widow who became a judge, but this particular tale had a deeper layer. For those who knew the true account, the lesson was not merely that a stranger had punished the wicked, but that a community had been given a second chance to reclaim its own humanity. The reckoning was terrifying, yes, but it was also cleansing, a fire that burned away the rot and allowed new growth to emerge from the ashes of their collective guilt. Gideon, in his final years, would sit on the porch with Margaret, both of them gray and content, and he would often remark that the greatest justice was not the gunshots but the laughter of their grandchildren. Those children, and their children after them, populated a Blackwood Creek that had become a beacon of compassion and law, a town that other settlements sought to emulate in its treatment of the vulnerable. When Gideon finally passed, His grave was dug beside Elias Hawthorne's, a deliberate choice, so that the two men who had loved and protected Margaret could watch over her together for eternity. Margaret lived another 10 years, her twisted frame finally succumbing to age, but her mind remained sharp as a tack, and she continued to dispense wisdom from her porch until the very end. On the day of her funeral, the entire territory seemed to gather, a sea of faces that stretched from the main street to the horizon, all of them carrying the debt of a town's former cruelty. The new preacher, a grandson of the timid schoolmaster who had once left eggs, delivered a eulogy that centered not on revenge, but on the profound power of one righteous stranger to change everything. He spoke of the cold, calculated justice that Gideon had executed, a justice that could have ended with corpses in the street, but instead chose the harder path of permanent transformation. The tale of the town that laughed at the crippled widow became a parable of the frontier, its details sometimes embellished, but its core truth remaining as solid as the granite of the mountains. It was a story that reminded every listener that cruelty is a disease that can infect an entire community, and the only cure is a reckoning so thorough that the patient either dies or is reborn. Blackwood Creek chose rebirth, and its streets now bore statues not of conquering generals, but of a bent woman with a cane and a man in a black duster, forever watching over the peace they forged. If this story of justice and redemption stirred something deep within you, please subscribe to Western Tales Official and like this video so that more tales of the frontier can find their way to your heart. We believe that every act of cruelty carries within it the seed of its own reckoning, and that sometimes an avenging angel wears dusty boots and a badge tarnished by too many hard journeys. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Tell us which moment of the reckoning made you feel the most satisfied, and if you have ever witnessed a modern-day Gideon who restored balance to a broken world. Until our next story from the untamed West, remember that the strongest spines are often the twisted ones, and the coldest justice can ignite the warmest hope for a better tomorrow.